Ghouls are said to come out at night and rob the graves of the recently deceased in search of food. But what was actually stealing the bodies in cemeteries across Europe and the United States in the late 17 and early 1800s was something less supernatural, something or someone more nefarious, more cunning, more human. The resurrectionists stole bodies not for food, but for profit, and maybe a little for science. But what happens when there's not enough bodies to meet the demand? The law of supply and demand tells us that the price for bodies will go up. And when the price goes up, others will enter the industry and find a way to increase the supply. I'm Mick Biddick, and this is History is Criminal. In today's episode, we take a look at England's dastardly duo, Burke and Hare, two men who took the old adage, if Muhammad will not come to the mountain must come to Muhammad, a little too far. For doctors throughout early human history, the body was a mystery. Under Roman law, human dissection was illegal. As a result, Roman physicians based their ideas on the dissection of animals like dogs and pigs. Between this and superstitions, Romans had several misconceptions about how the human body worked. These moratoriums on human dissection were made only worse by the rise of Christianity. Many believed that the body would return in the same condition that it had died with the second coming. So to dissect the body would do great harm to the subject's everlasting soul. Medical schools relied on outdated and inaccurate illustrations. It would be unusual for a new doctor to have seen the inside of a human body before they cut someone open. Of course, their first time would have been under the supervision of a senior physician, but even the senior physician would be laboring under some false perceptions. When it came to the acceptable for dissection for medical knowledge, it would be those condemned to death used for dissection. The first sanctioned dissection would not occur until 1315 in Bologna. It was performed on a convicted criminal and done on public display. Because those executed were normally left on display until they rotted away, it was unusual to find a body of an executed prisoner to dissect. In the UK, it wasn't until 1752 that the Murder Act that a large number of bodies would become available. The Murder Act allowed judges to sentence executed to be dissected in place of having their bodies left on public display. This opened the door to a great deal of legal bodies to use. Before the Murder Act, men known as resurrectionists would rob the graves of the newly dead. Medical schools and med students would pay good money for those bodies, and the fresher the body, the better. The Murder Act seriously hurt the business of the resurrectionists. But in 1823, a new law gave the resurrectionists a whole new economic boom. The Judgment of Death Act allowed judges greater latitude when sentencing. Many crimes that had been capital offenses were now punishable by lesser means. While enlightened and humane, it also greatly reduced the number of bodies that could be legally used in dissection. The resurrectionists were now heading into a golden age of grave robbery, with bodies fetching between 7 to 10 pounds each. And while it is hard to make a direct comparison between the value of British pounds in the early 1700s to US dollars today, this would be equal to several months' pay for unskilled laborers. Grave robbing would become an epidemic. The authorities began to take measures to keep the dead safe. Graveyards hired men to patrol the yards at night. And even for the toughest people, this had to be unnerving, guarding the dead so that they would stay in their graves. The night watch, think police on patrol, were ordered to make their rounds closer to the cemetery. Those who could afford it placed large slabs on top of their recently deceased graves, or locked iron gates across tombs. Even this sometimes proves inefficient, as slabs and iron bars were broken. Where there was good money to be made, resurrectionists would find a way. Grave robbing was legally a gray area under British law. Under the law, bodies actually didn't belong to anybody. So a resurrectionist could only be charged with stealing the clothes of the dead, which I assume if you left the clothes behind, that would mean you're okay. Of course, you also had to worry about vigilantes who would exact their own form of justice on grave robbers. In that case, you might want to leave the clothes on because a person who's pissed off to the point of violence when they catch you stealing their dead auntie just might not be the person you want to run into when you have their dead, undressed auntie. Grave robbers were taking risk, and for those risks, they would be rewarded. In the Scottish city of Edinburgh, demand was at a peak for fresh bodies. Surgeon Square had 6 lecture halls. Medical professors were on their own when it came to finding bodies for dissection. It was a simple question of supply and demand. As more and more professors and students needed bodies, the courts were just not supplying enough of the executed. The resurrectionists were having a hard time filling those orders of the professors. It was in this world of grave robbing and selling of the dead that William Burke and William Hare stumbled into in 1827. The two men were remarkably similar. Both had immigrated to Scotland from Ireland. Both had common law marriages, Burke with Helen and Hare with Margaret. Both had worked on the Union Canal, but actually met at Middleton while working on the harvest. It was there the two developed a connection. When Hare headed to Edinburgh, where he opened a lodging house, Burke and Helen soon followed, moving into Hare's boarding house. The two couples soon gained a reputation for hard drinking and wild behavior. Now, not to play into any stereotypes here, but if you're known as the hard drinkers in a Scottish town living among Irish immigrants, you've got to be doing some serious drinking. No offense to my Celtic peeps there. Money was hard to come by in the lower classes, in the working neighborhoods of Edinburgh. So, when one of Hare's boarders, a man known as Old Donald, died, owing months' worth of back rent, Hare needed a way to get the money. And it wasn't exactly a secret that medical schools bought the deceased. Burke and Hare found a man named William Ferguson, an aide to Dr. Robert Knox. Ferguson, who would later be known as Sir Ferguson, a doctor to Queen Victoria, asked little questions, and he did pay good money, paying Burke and Hare £7 10 shillings for Old Donald. This not only paid off Old Donald's debt, but left a little extra. This looked to be an easy and quick money for the pair, and something that could be easily repeated. Now, it should be noted that Burke and Hare were never truly resurrectionists. After all, stealing bodies was hard work and required one to beat the competition to the freshest dead. Then, of course, you'd have to dig up the grave under the cover of darkness, avoid the eyes of the night watch and any private security that was hired to protect the cemetery. Once you had the body in hand, you'd have to take it across town to your waiting client, all without being seen by the night watch or just folks who were out wandering. No, Burke and Hare had a waiting supply for them. Hare's boarders, the old, the poor, often without family nearby or friends, they were the golden goose. And when another boarder became ill, Burke and Hare decided, why wait? The man was going to die anyway, so why not help him along to his grave? Here they developed their basic MO. First, they would ply the victim with whiskey. Once they were too drunk to put up a fight, they would smother the victim. While buyers might not have been the most morally pure, the victim couldn't have obvious signs of violence. They wouldn't want to raise suspicions or possibly damage the goods. This method of killing would even become known as burking. They were shocked at the ease with which they were able to sell the body to Dr. Knox. Knox, for his part, had oversold himself, promising a fresh cadaver for every lecture this season. This has made his lectures extremely popular at Surgeon Square, and he was under pressure to keep his word. He told the two killers that he would take whatever bodies they could produce, no questions asked, and he would pay upwards of £10 for fresh bodies, at a time when the average laborer in England made about £1 per week. For a 10-month period, Burke and Hare would not disappoint. Their MO worked like a charm, often picking those in society that wouldn't be missed, the elderly without families, beggars, and prostitutes. They were credited with at least 16 murders, but some believe the number to be much higher. This is not to say that things always went smoothly for our two ghouls. Mary Patterson was a local prostitute. She found her way to Hare's lodging house. She and her friend, Janet Brown, had been lured to the house by Burke and Hare with the promise of a good time and plenty of booze. Luckily for Janet, she left before becoming too drunk to walk home. Now, logic would tell you that Burke and Hare should have called off their plan at this point. Janet, having never gotten too drunk to the point that she lost her senses, knew where she was and who Burke and Hare were. It would seem far too risky to go ahead with killing Mary after Janet left. But the two carried on undeterred, leaving a very alive potential witness. Mary was burked, and the body quickly sold to Dr. Knox. No one questioned why the body was less than 6 hours old and showed no signs of having ever been buried. When some of the medical students said they thought they recognized the cadaver, Knox brushed it off. By the time anyone noticed the missing prostitute, the body had been long dissected and disposed of. As for Janet being able to say the last place she saw Mary was at Hare's boarding house, you can imagine how much faith the authorities would put into the word of a drunken prostitute. Burke and Hare started to take a risk. The chance for profit was too strong. James Wilson, a.k.a. Daft Jamie, was a well-known street performer. He would sing, tell jokes, and perform mental calculations. It was said that Jamie could tell you the day of the week for any date in history. People would give Jimmy coins for his act. Some believed that Jamie might have had savant syndrome, or what used to be called an autistic savant. The point was, Jamie was someone that would be missed. The next problem with this chosen victim was that Jamie, despite having a clubfoot, was a large and powerfully built 18-year-old. And worse, he didn't drink. It was Hare who came across Jamie, who was out looking for his mother. Hare told Jamie he knew where his mother was and led him to the boarding house. Met at the boarding house by Burke, they offered Jamie a whiskey, which he turned down. Unable to get Jamie drunk to the point of not fighting back, they had to turn to less subtle methods. The two would have to overpower Jamie. This was no easy task and required both men to take part in the attack. After a substantial struggle, they were able to subdue him. But the body would have clear signs of the struggle, and worse, Jamie was a known person in Edinburgh. Dr. Knox, who would always claim he had no idea where his cadavers came from, took some interesting steps with this body. The head and club foot were removed before presenting the body to the dissection theater. Knox never offered an explanation for removing the parts, but it seems clear that he wanted to disguise the corpse. Burke and Hare had survived getting clumsy. The killing of known locals should have been their undoing, but they were able to continue for several more months. They didn't always burke their victims. In a rare double murder, they poisoned an old grandmother and then killed her blind grandson. Hare killed the boy by snapping his back over his leg. Think Bane in that Batman movie, but instead of nursing himself back to health, he was dead. They even killed a relative of Helen, Anne McDougall, who had come to take a visit. Now, talk about having troubles with your in-law, this goes to a whole new level. This begs the question, what did the wives know? While Helen and Margaret were both cleared of any charges, it would seem they would have had to have noticed how their boarders just kept vanishing. Not only were Burke and Hare getting sloppy, but they also had a little falling out. Burke believed Hare had been holding out on him. This caused Burke and Helen to move out and start their own boarding house. This wouldn't stop the pair from working together, however, and it would seem it would just double the number of potential victims. Marjorie Campbell Dougherty, she would take up lodgings with the Burkes. At the same time, James and Anne Gray also took up residence at Burke's boarding house. That is until the Burkes asked the Grays to spend one night at Hare's boarding house. Now, while this might have seemed odd that the Burkes sent James and Anne to stay at Hare's for one night, they went, and seemingly without asking any questions. This gave Burke and Hare the opportunity to ply their trade on Marjorie. Now, this seems like a really dumb move on their part. Even with James and Anne gone for the night, when they returned the next day, it would seem they would have some questions. And if people questioned why Marjorie vanished, James and Anne would be witness to the fact that the last place she was seen was at Burke's. But it seems Burke and Hare were prepared for this eventuality. They would tell James and Anne that Marjorie had become argumentative, so they sent her away. At which point, Burke snidely commented, "Well, she's quiet enough now." Then, to add to their suspicion, they told the Grays to stay away from the pile of hay in the corner of the room. Then, in true brilliance, they left the Grays alone in the room. Now, following basic human nature, Anne Gray went and looked under the pile of hay that she was told to stay away from. There, she saw the body of Marjorie. As one would, the Grays freaked out and wanted to go to the police. Helen, however, stepped in and offered the Grays £10 to forget what they saw. The Grays, seemingly the only two people in this story with any morals, turned down the money and went to the cops. Before the police could arrive, Burke and Hare had already handed off the body to Dr. Knox. They must have hoped that the police would never think to look at the medical school just down the road, who was known for buying bodies, or that Knox would have disposed of the body. But as it turned out, Burke and Hare's luck had run out. Marjorie's body was found, and Burke and Hare were arrested. Janet Brown, at this point, was then able to actually identify clothes left in Burke's boarding house as belonging to Mary Patterson, giving the authorities a second murder charge on the pair. Now, why in the world would you keep the clothes from your murder victim? With Burke and Hare, they probably thought they could sell those at some points and get a quid or two out of it. As things started to unravel, Burke and Hare both tried to blame everything on the other. The police had no hard evidence that anyone had committed murder. The eyewitness story of the Grays would be as simple as us versus them, and the Grays had not actually seen the murder, only found the body. The clothes left behind could be accounted for by any of the lodgers. Of course, no forensics or DNA evidence that would not be available in 1828. As for the medical school purchasing the bodies without the bodies to examine, it would be hard to prove murder. The only body that they had was that of Marjorie, and with no forensics, it would just be speculation that Hare and Burke had done the deed. But with the threat of the gallows hanging over their heads, it would be Hare who would make a deal. In the words of the English, he turned king's evidence in return for immunity for himself and Margaret. At trial, Burke would be tied to 16 deaths. It would be the murders of Anne McDougall, Mary Patterson, and James Wilson, a.k.a. Daft Jamie, that would become the basis of the prosecution's case. Indicted on the 8th of December, the trial would take place on the 24th and 25th of December, Christmas not being all that big a deal to the courts in 1820s. It took the jury no time to return a verdict of guilty for Burke. He was sentenced to be hanged. In the irony of ironies, he was then to be sent for dissection. Helen, who was charged as an accomplice, her case was, quote, not proven. Under Scottish law, Not proven means the prosecutor failed to present enough evidence to find the person guilty, but shows they believe they had some connection to the crime. For Helen, this meant she could go free. However, she would still be held for some time for her own safety, as the crowd wanted to Burke her. The Hares were held while Daft Jamie's mother launched an unsuccessful civil case against them. The three would manage to slink their way out of town after Burke's execution. Sources seem to conflict on the fate of Hare. Some claim that Hare was most likely changed his name and managed to vanish from the pages of history. Others, however, state that Hare was tracked to the house of a person named Atkinson, described as an accomplice of his. A mob demanded that Hare be sent out of the house, or they would kill everyone in the dwelling. The crowd then burst into the door searching for Hare. Someone on the outside saw Hare attempting to pull a reverse Santa Claus by climbing out of the chimney. This escape attempt would somehow fail, and he was quickly seized. The mob beat him so badly before the police arrived that Hare was taken to a surgeon where his wounds were bandaged. Reportedly, Hare died from his injuries on April 10th, 1829. Later stories, however, have him living out the rest of his life in Ireland. Helen MacDougall, Burke's common-law wife, shows up once more in history. While attempting to get passage to Ireland, she was recognized. People surrounded her, shouting, "She's Burke's wife! Murder her! Burke her!" According to a broadside published on April 25th, 1829, her death was neither quick nor painless. The crowd of mostly women jumped her, strangling her until a woman reportedly stomped on her chest and head. She died a few minutes later from her injuries. Margaret Hare is reported to have made her escape to never be heard from again. As for Dr. Knox, he was cleared of any wrongdoing, but his reputation and career were in tatters. It seems that not everyone believed the good doctor was as naive as he claimed. Burke's execution was set for the 28th of January, 1829. An estimated 20,000 gathered for the hanging. While normally workers drew straws for the building of the gallows, not wanting to take part in the gruesome task, this time volunteers came forward to build the gallows. The crowd showed none of the usual sympathy that was reserved for someone facing the hangman. This was no down-on-their-luck person who found themselves in a bit of hard times, who had made a desperate move. Burke was a stone-cold ghoul, and they wanted to see him die. As he made his way to the gallows, the crowd cheered, yelling, "Murderer! Choke him! Burke him!" When he dropped with the noose around his neck, the crowd roared with approval. One reporter stated one man was acting like some kind of morbid hype man, egging the mob on each time the body convulsed. As his body was taken down, the crowd rushed forward. People took pieces of rope and slivers of the casket as macabre's keepsakes. At his dissection, medical students even took souvenirs. Some took pieces of Burke's skin and used those for book bindings. What might be the sickest twist? A wallet was made from his scalp. This wallet and his skeleton are still on display at Edinburgh's Surgeon Square. The story had consumed the people of the British Isles. Plays, stories, and even a children's rhyme followed. Up the close, down the stairs, but been with Burke and Hare. Burke the butcher, Hare the thief, and Knox the boy who buys the beef. The murders and the trial had taken the media by storm, fueling Victorian England's desire for grisly and gory details. In the age of yellow journalism, each paper tried to outperform the other when it came to publishing the gruesome details. Newspapers were learning that death displayed in the most gory details possible sold papers. Willing to publish every gruesome fact, even embellishing or printing rumors and straight-up lies, the story would reach every corner of the UK. Some began to wonder if the laws on dissection had helped set the stage for this heinous act. When Landon Burkers was convicted of also killing and selling his victims to medical schools. Parliament responded by passing the Anatomy Act of 1832. The new law made it easier for medical schools to procure cadavers. It also allowed people to donate their bodies to science. This marked the end of the golden age of the resurrectionists and helped push advancements of medicine. This has been History is Criminal. Join us in 2 weeks as we take a look at the hunt for the killers of Abraham Lincoln, a story with some weird details that don't make it into most history books. I'd like to give a thank you and a shout out to our sources: recollections.biz, The Invention of Murder, allthingsinteresting.com, and historyuk.com. Intro and outro music, Halloween Horror Creepy Piano by Alex Production, supplied by onsound.eu.